I see America as a bunch of people that migrated over here. You know, it's all migration, you know, like we were talking before. In the old days, it was all migration because of what was happening, you know, wars or, you know, famine or whatever. People moved, people were escaping. Later on, when I started doing my research, yeah, and had my what do you call it, genealogy done, did I find out that I had Lipan and Chiricahua blood in me. More than likely everything too, because you know Apaches intermarried into other tribes. So my grandmother was kind of like a herbalist. So some people called her a healing lady or something because everybody would come to her for herbs and stuff. And then my grandfather always taught me. He would tell me certain things that later on I found out were you know, Apache traits. My first grandfather was born in 1895, my father's father, and then his family in 1899 they moved to the United States and they settled in El Paso. And then my grandmother was about the same. She was born in 1903, and they moved to El Paso also. On my mother's side, I think my grandmother came into the United States in 1919, 1920, and my grandfather came a little bit earlier than that, like 1908. He was pretty young when he came to the United States.
From where?
From Durango, the mountains in Durango. My grandmother came from, I think it was De Leon, and most of on my father's side, most of them came from Jalisco. For the most part, I grew up thinking I was Mexican, you know, because that's what we were told by our grandparents. So, because we came from Mexico, so they said we were from Mexico or Mexican. So, but later on, you know, I never felt like I was a Mexican, you know, even though my grandmother and my grandfather spoke Spanish. They never taught us the Apache ways or nothing except for little things, subtle things, you know, and you know it just sparked my interest. But when I joined the Navy, most of the Native Americans that I always met, they were always telling me, "What nation do you belong to?" You know, so I knew that I had Native American. And Native Americans, for some reason, know who other Native Americans are just by looking at them. I know that when my grandmother visited later on in the 70s and 80s, she would go back to Mexico and she would say that our family out there were still hunting with slings because in Mexico you can't own a weapon. So, and all the deer and everything had been, you know, killed with a slingshot. So,
Slingshot.
yeah, slingshot. You know,
Yeah.
like, and that's how they hunt over there in Mexico still. My friend that was an anthropologist said that there's still wild Apaches up in the mountains that are still living in the old way. They're called broncos. You know, I've learned a lot from him over, you know, from what he told me when he was coming to visit and stuff like that. So ever since I was small, I was always interested in making weapons, you know, bows and arrows, and you know, so they always called me El Indio, you know, so or Geronimo. My grandfather would call me Geronimo when I started letting my hair grow back in around 60, what was it, 67, somewhere around there. I was still pretty young. I was still in elementary and I started letting my hair grow. So, and then later on, my grandfather would always tell me that, you know, be careful, the Mexicans will take it. And I never understood, you know, I said, okay, you know, but yeah, it was little subtle things like that, you know, and then later on I found out that it was because, you know, of the bounty that Mexico had on Apaches from 1870 to 1915. So they had bounties on Apache scalps, and it was 100 pesos for a male, 75 for a female, and 50 pesos for a child. So, but the Texas scalp hunters would always go after, you know, any Indian that had long hair. They pretty much just massacred, and they'd massacre a whole village and stuff just for the scalps. So, so it was pretty bad, you know. But those are some of the things that kind of gave me hints that, you know, we were something. And then later on, when I got out of the Navy, that's when I started really getting into reading books and stuff on the Apaches and stuff. And then I learned about the bounties and all that stuff. So, and then things started clicking and making sense of what my grandfather would tell me. And I go, you know, when they've asked me about Columbus, I go, it was an atrocity, but, you know, that's history. We can't change it. There's no way we can change history. And if you don't remember history, you will repeat history. The only thing I tell people when they ask me that is that I tell them, all I know is that my family survived, so that means they did something right, that they wouldn't have to suffer like others, and you know, and they did the right thing for us to continue being in this world. So I'm just glad that they were survivors and not victims.